Then there's the caveman beard. I'm not sure I'm very qualified to talk on this topic, really, but I have to say I'm more with the Russell Brown stubble type in terms of attractiveness.
Okay, so you're not a beard person necessarily?
I think that they really suit some men and they really don't suit others, and it's a bit like fashion with women. You sometimes need to take advice as to what suits best.
What do you think of the trend in general? So do you think it'll pass away? Because it has been quite the phenomenon in the last 5, 6, 7 years, hasn't it?
Oh, maybe even the last 10 years,
do you
really.
think?
Yeah, no, fashions will change.
Yes, they will.
That's inevitable. I mean, when you look at things we used to wear.
Yes, everything does a cycle. I'm sure the clean-shaven look will be back before we know it.
Yeah.
Do you think so?
Yeah, although, I mean, I used to enjoy shaving and then I didn't enjoy shaving anymore. I used to think of it as sort of a man's simple sacrament to have a good shave.
So you've never been clean-shaven?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have, but I've now got a good beard trimmer and it just seems easier to run that over my face.
Right. Hey, Thomas says another issue which I don't know has been touched on is accessibility. A number of bank websites and apps are not accessible for people who use assistive technology. 1 in 5 New Zealanders has a disability. They to a customers and a branch is close, then these people will leave. I can't quite understand your text there, but I do understand what you're saying in terms of the websites and apps. Just briefly now on this one, are you one of those people that hate networking but realise that it is important if you want to get ahead in your line of work? A BBC article has a piece titled "Networking for People Who Hate to Network" and offers a couple of suggestions. It can be very daunting for people who are introverts, filling your diary with coffee meetings, obligatory meetings and meals. But a less taxing form is called loose touch. That's been proposed. More on that soon. But are either of you natural networkers? Heather?
I didn't used to enjoy networking and now I really do. I think that's sort of part of politics. And one of the things that I do in my consulting business, TalkPoint, is help people network effectively. Who's the right person to contact in a specific situation, and then how do you go about it for best effect. So I think it's something that you can learn. It's not something that many people come to naturally, but it is something that there's tricks to do. Yeah.
A lot of people hate network. You're a freelancer, Russell. I mean, how hard do you find it? Because this article suggests widening your circle out to your lesser known colleagues and a very wide circle, bringing them in, and you can get, ideas there.
Yeah, I can sort of see both sides of it, actually. I mean, I work from home, so I do feel the need to get out and meet people. And I meet a wider range of people because I do all different kinds of things. And I've noticed when I've been in the editorial office with people who work the same job 9 to 5, that I actually know about a whole lot of things they don't. And there's no substitute for getting in the room with people. My problem sometimes is that I have a degree of face blindness that can really get me into strife.
Oh, is that right?
I have failed to recognise people that I've known for years or misidentified them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that? You just reintroduce yourself?
Oh, you wait for cues and you just give me a clue. I'm sure I can get it.
Name tags are a great thing.
Yes.
Louise says, beards appeared to come in with the Game of Thrones, and someone says, I'm a woman, I love beards. All men should have them, please, full stop. So there you go, Russell, you're on the right side of history with that particular one.
Oh, I'm on the right side of Heather, though, so,
Heather Roy, you have been wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. Checkpoint next.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. On tonight's programme, New Zealand first torpedoes a capital gains tax in any form. The Prime Minister concedes defeat and abandons that policy ship. So who's celebrating and who is commiserating? Housing New Zealand tenants evicted over bogus meth tests will have some of their MSD debts wiped by the government. A string of botch-ups is blamed for unsterilised medical equipment being used on Hawke's Bay patients. The patients are still waiting to find out if they've been infected with anything. Workers who were restoring Notre Dame Cathedral are questioned by police about yesterday's fire, and the K9 found while dog paddling 220 kilometres off the shore of Thailand.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Prime Minister has ruled out any kind of capital gains tax in a surprise move that shows the power of her coalition partner, Winston Peters. Jacinda Ardern has announced the government won't be taking up the tax working group's recommendation and that Labor will no longer campaign for such a tax under her leadership. Labor and the Greens still support the tax, however, agreement couldn't be reached with New Zealand First. Ms Ardern says while this is disappointing, she is a pragmatic idealist and it will not damage the coalition relationship.
We reach consensus on a daily basis on a number of issues that are critically important to New Zealand's future. Whilst I'm disappointed we've not been able to progress CGT, there are many other issues we progress every day that I'm incredibly proud of.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. The New Zealand First leader says he couldn't support the tax because he saw no compelling evidence it would improve equality. Winston Peters says while he was happy to hear the debate about a broad capital gains tax, he wasn't convinced by the arguments, and it's clear that most of the country wasn't either. He says he was put off by the complexity of the system.
I'd never seen anywhere in the world where the stated purpose for which it was introduced ended up being successful. We decided there are better ways by which we might reform our tax system to give people a fairer go, and where the gap between the rich and the poor can be closed. But this is not the pathway.
Winston Peters says the focus needs to be cracking down on land banking and on multinationals who aren't paying their fair share of tax. The Greens co-leader is walking back on his comment, questioning whether the government would deserve to be re-elected if it didn't bring in a capital gains tax. James Shaw says while he's disappointed, his previous comments were a call for bold action.
We are taking bold action, like I said, on climate change, on ending homelessness, on cleaning up our rivers. You win some, you lose some. If I had to choose between this government, which has done more in the last 18 months than the national government did in the last 9 years, I would choose this government every single time.
James Shaw says the Greens will keep working with Labor to find other ways to make the tax system fairer. The country's largest ever transport project, Auckland's underground City Rail Link, will cost $1 billion more than planned. City Rail Link's chief executive, Sean Sweeney, has today announced a new price tag of $4.4 billion. Dr Sweeney says the $1 billion increase is due to increased construction and contingency costs and a decision to accommodate longer trains. It's now up to the Crown and Auckland Council to approve the revised budget. Last month, CRL assured the government it is on track for completion by 2024, despite problems with its previous contractors. The Armed Offenders Squad could not see the accused gunman as they approached the Al Noor Mosque during the Christchurch terror attack because he was obscured by a bus. 43 people died at the mosque on Deans Avenue on March the 15th, and another 7 were killed in the Linwood Mosque. RNZ police reporter Ben Strang has more.
The Police Commissioner, Mike Bush, has revealed some of the details of the response to the Christchurch mosque attacks. A bus blocked the view of the Armed Offenders Squad as they approached the Deans Avenue Mosque from Riccarton Road, allowing the gunman to escape unseen. Officers didn't realise he'd left the mosque and were unable to get a description of the vehicle. The accused man wasn't arrested for another 12 minutes after he had attacked the Linwood Mosque. Mike Bush says police were first contacted about the attack by Parliamentary Services security staff 44 seconds after receiving an email at 20 to 2. A document was attached to the email detailing his plans for the attack. The first 111 call from the scene was received seconds later. Mr Bush says he remains incredibly proud of the police response to the attack. This is Ben Strang.
Northland DHB says anti-vaccination sentiment is taking a toll on immunisation rates in the region. Only 63% of eligible children have been vaccinated against the new deadly strain of meningococcal disease, despite an intensive community campaign over summer. The DHB's General Manager, Dr Nick Chamberlain, says that's a drop on past meningococcal campaigns, and he believes the anti-immunisation film Vaxxed is partly to blame. He says the filmmakers launched the film in the far north last year and have a lot to answer for.
Had many showings of that movie, and we saw almost immediately a drop in our immunisation rates, not to do with meningococcal disease, but our standard immunisation program, and it dropped about 5 or so percentage points, and we've tracked that since, and it really hasn't recovered.
Nick Chamberlain says Northland children are now more vulnerable not only to meningitis but to all infectious diseases, including measles. It's 5:05. The Wallaby international Israel Folau wants Rugby Australia's bid to sack him over his latest homophobic comments on social media referred to a code of conduct hearing. Rugby Australia issued him with a breach notice last week saying it intended sacking him over the posts. Its chief executive Raylene Castle says they'll try to confirm a hearing date as soon as possible. Leading Test rugby referee Nigel Owens has described Folau's religious views as narrow-minded and potentially very, very hurtful to a lot of people. Owens, who is gay, says high-profile players such as Folau need to understand the influence they have over young, vulnerable people.
I respect that somebody has the right to have that opinion. I don't agree with the opinion, and I think although everybody has a right to have his view, you then have to understand that there are consequences when you express a view that can be very, very hurtful to a lot of people.
International rugby referee Nigel Owens. Barcelona are through to European football's Champions League semi-finals for the first time in 4 years after a 3-0 second leg quarter-final win over Manchester United. Ajax of Amsterdam are also through to the semi-finals after they beat Juventus 2-1 in their second leg quarter-final. Five-time winners Barcelona will play either Porto or Liverpool in the final four, while Ajax will play the winner of Manchester City and Tottenham Hotspur. Both those remaining quarterfinals are tomorrow morning. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, it's a rather special show for a special occasion. Karen Hayes joining me from Auckland, I'm in Wellington, and together we'll bring you highlights from Christchurch of this evening's Arahanui They Are Us concert for the victims of last month's mosque attacks. We'll bring you information on the performers, insights into the occasion, but mostly lots of great music on nights from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Great Barrier Island and Coromandel Peninsula, fine but isolated showers developing this evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mostly cloudy. Occasional showers clearing south of the Wairoa district this afternoon. For the remainder of the North Island, mainly fine, cloudy in Wellington, Wairarapa and Taihape morning and night. For the South Island, fine apart from areas of cloud or fog morning and night. A few showers about the fields tomorrow. Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy with a few showers. It's 5:07. You're with RNZ National.
Thanks, Susanna, and this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. A proposed capital gains tax is dead in the water. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has abandoned any plans to implement a CGT, not just under this government, but for as long as she's in charge. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
For months, Jacinda Ardern has pushed for a CGT. It was her captain's call to keep one on the table during the election campaign. Today, a remarkable backdown, a complete and utter failure to reach consensus.
Today, I am announcing that the coalition government has ruled out implementing a capital gains tax.
For 3 elections, Labour has campaigned on a capital gains tax. The Prime Minister still thinks it's the right thing to do. But she says the support isn't there, not in Parliament, and in her eyes, not amongst the public either.
For that reason, I am today setting out that for certainty's sake, that under my leadership, we will no longer campaign for or implement a capital gains tax. Not because I don't believe in it, but because I don't believe New Zealand does.
It's a massive victory for New Zealand First, which has long opposed a capital gains tax. The simple fact is Jacinda Ardern needed their 9 votes and couldn't get them.
It's not a matter of being happy or who won or who lost. What really matters is, have we got the right policy, all of us, that has the support of what I believe is the mass majority of New Zealanders.
Winston Peters says his party blocked the tax because it was too complex and wouldn't achieve its stated purpose. But for a moment he let the diplomatic facade slip, asked whether there might be a quid pro quo with Labour, given he'd blocked one of its key policies.
May I remind you, the Labour Party is in government because of my party. We had choices where no other parties did.
What is a win for New Zealand First is bitter disappointment for the Greens. In February, co-leader James Shaw laid down a challenge, asking whether the government deserved to be re-elected if it didn't introduce a capital gains tax. Now he finds himself having to answer his own question.
Yes, this government does deserve to be re-elected. We are taking bold action, like I said, on climate change, on ending homelessness, on cleaning up our rivers. I am disappointed with the decision not to proceed on a capital gains tax, but, you know, you win some, you lose some.
The Greens are not the only ones thwarted. The full Labour caucus held a teleconference shortly after midday.
There was disappointment, but acceptance of the outcome.
The opposition, on the other hand, chuffed.
It's a big win for National. It's a big win for New Zealanders, I think, here. We've embarrassed the government into this.
But while Simon Bridges may be counting this as a short-term win, it could hurt in the long term. It robs National of one of its strongest attack lines and voids months of policy and strategy work. Right at the same time, there are questions swirling about Mr Bridges' leadership.
What we've seen today, actually, in the so-called year of delivery, a Prime Minister and a government that's bereft of ideas.
The tax working group will cost roughly $2 million. It had recommended a comprehensive tax, one which covered farms, businesses, shares and KiwiSaver. Instead, nada. But the Prime Minister says it's not a waste of money. The government will look at other recommendations the group made, she says, and has already ordered work into ways to prevent land banking. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch.
Well, we wanted to speak to Winston Peters. We didn't get an outright refusal, but we didn't get a yes either. So he was not too keen to commit to an interview. Greens co-leader James Shaw also didn't seem keen. He apparently has a jam-packed schedule today and didn't have any free time to talk about the capital gains tax. We've approached his colleague, Marama Davidson, as well, but haven't heard anything back from her. The offers remain open. We're standing by to take your calls. The former chair of the government's tax working group says he's disappointed but not surprised that its proposal for a capital gains tax was rejected outright. The tax working group recommended wide-ranging changes to the tax system covering second properties, including the family batch, land, farms, most shares and business assets. That's all off the agenda now. Sir Michael Cullen was the chair of the working group, and I asked him what he thinks of the news that there will be no capital gains tax in any form.
I thought it was always going to be very hard to get New Zealand First and Winston Peters over the line on capital gains taxes. I mean, their voting base is very much older than the average, very much more Pākehā than the average. In other words, very much the people who actually own capital assets. So it was going to be more difficult for them to deal with the issue. And another signal, fairly early on, it was reported to me that Troy Barker was advising them, and he was publicly attacking capital gains. So I had this sort of sinking feeling that it was going to be quite difficult. But I had hoped that at least we might have got something like a broad-based capital gains on land over the line, because that's the largest area of problems in terms of misdirected investment in the country.
OK, there's a few things in there. Let's start with Winston Peters in New Zealand First. Do you think he'd made his mind up before this report even came out?
No. I think to refer to Winston, that wouldn't be so. I'm sure he gave consideration to it, but everything in his background would tend to suggest. I mean, not to be too unkind to Winston, he's always been more in favour of increasing spending than increasing taxes to pay for it. So, faced with a whole new tax, one that was always controversial, and one you could argue about where the incidence of that tax was going to lie. The working group was quite clear it would be very much on the upper end of the income and wealth scale. Then it's not and given that New Zealand First is not exactly shall we say flourishing in the opinion polls, so they haven't got a lot of political capital to use up on something of this sort.
So this is all on Winston Peters in your view? In New Zealand First?
My understanding is that Labor has come around to the position of just perhaps a tax on rental housing. I personally have found that quite difficult to support, because at least with rental housing, people are providing a service to other people in the form of housing, whereas with, say, holiday homes, some of which are worth a lot of money, those are purely personal use, but very substantial capital gains can arise out of them. So it did seem to me that it got narrowed down to a point where I personally would have felt more comfortable with an outcome with no CGT than one which was so limited that it would have got very little income in and would have singled out one group.
Do you know if New Zealand First was comfortable with going ahead with a CGT on second properties, or they objected to that as well?
They objected to everything, as far as I understand it. They did not support any form of CGT.
So this has come down to... Given that, sorry to interrupt, but given you described the voter base there of New Zealand First and you talked about their political capital, so in your mind, how would you characterise this decision? Has politics prevailed over principle here in the end?
Well, that wouldn't be unusual, Lisa, would it, when it comes to things of this sort? But particularly, I mean, this is the reality of MMP politics, that you have multi-party governments, and just because one party is much larger than the others, it can't bully its way into having a majority. You have to respect the rights of minor parties who are involved in that government. So in this case, there's clearly not a majority support in Parliament for such a tax. And I think the Prime Minister ought to make clear that as long as she's Prime Minister, that issue of a capital gains tax is now off the agenda.
But has the reverse happened? Has the party, the smaller party, bullied the bigger party here?
Not bullied. It's just effectively a veto power. I mean, if you look at the European Union with 27 members, only one of them had to object to the extension of the Brexit deadline, and it would have been dead, and Britain would now be out of Europe without a deal at all. That's just the nature of these kinds of agreements. You can expect a degree of compromise on occasions, but on this occasion, I don't think it's surprising, but it's disappointing because I think to some extent, Mr. Peters understood where a lot of his vote comes from, which is not from people who've got large capital assets. So, but ultimately, it seems like there was zero compromise at all. You talk about some compromise. There couldn't really be much of a compromise in terms of what was on the table for discussion, because if you took away just a CGT on rental housing, that left nothing anyway. So you'd introduce a bill with no content, which is a rather pointless exercise, really. Well, do you feel like your whole work has been a pointless exercise then as well? Oh, absolutely not. I mean, if you look at the work we did, the bulk of the two reports together, because much of the interim report wasn't repeated in the final report, is not on CGT. Because CGT was complicated, we spent a lot of time on it in the last 3 or 4 months going through the details, but the government's accepted a very large amount of the other parts of the report. That's being worked into the current work program for IRD and signals around further work carrying on later on other parts of the report. So that's very pleasing, and particularly some of the conceptual stuff has been accepted in there. But the rationale behind this, if you listened to Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party, was about a fairer tax system, creating a fairer tax system. So it's not happening. What does that mean? What does that say about us? We don't care about fairness? Well, I think we're capable, like almost all human beings. I don't think New Zealanders are any different in that regard, of having two sides to our brain. One that says we want lots and lots of goodies provided by the government. The other says we're not really all that keen on paying for them. And in this case, we've got a tax system in New Zealand which is only very moderately redistributed by international standards, because the income tax progression from the bottom rate to the top is relatively small, and GST is somewhat regressive, so you take the two together, is not very redistributive. CGT would have made the tax system somewhat more redistributive, but not hugely so. We still would have had one of the less redistributive tax systems in the world. And by the way, I mean the developed economies. Yeah, so what are the consequences of not doing this? What are we left with now? Well, if you look out to the long-term future, all else being equal, then, bluntly, people on low to middle incomes will end up bearing or paying probably a somewhat higher tax than would otherwise have been the case, or, alternatively, we will have less money for social services, new drugs, and so on and so forth. So in your view, we are so in your view, are we fundamentally worse off as a society for having not picked up this mantle and run with it? I think this is a chance to actually grasp the nettle. This is the first time since 1989, I think, the discussion document was put out by the fourth Labour government. First time that there's been a sort of coherent and well worked through proposition. There were quite a few shaky ends we worked through with further discussion, but basically a reasonably complete proposal. That's gone, and I suspect, I said before this some months ago that I thought this was probably last chance saloon. That's that might be an exaggeration. As a historian, I ought to know better than to make statements like that. But I think it'll be quite some time before people come back to this. And if and when we do, probably the demographic factors will be even less in favour of getting support for it, because we will have an older population, young people with few assets, older people having accumulated the assets, but older people tending to vote more than younger people.
Well, considering everything that you've just stated, Sir Michael, you were in government for 9 years, you didn't bring in a capital gains tax. Jacinda Ardern has said that that's it, she will no longer campaign or push this. So, put bluntly, in your lifetime, do you expect to see a capital gains tax?
Well, no. I don't actually expect to live to a very old age, but nevertheless, I don't expect to see it. But I'm reminded the former Premier of Southern Rhodesia said, not black majority rule in my lifetime, and there was. So if I hang in there till the age of my mother, which was 98 when she died, who knows?
And that was Sir Michael Kylan, who was the chair of the tax working group and, of course, the former finance minister. It is 20 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think about this decision over the capital gains tax. Right to abandon it altogether? Are you pleased? Would you have preferred something in between? Let us know. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at checkpointrnz or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. French police have begun questioning workers involved in the renovation work at Notre Dame Cathedral following yesterday's fire, which severely damaged the Paris landmark. The blaze destroyed a large part of the roof and the spire, but the two belfries and the huge stained glass windows were spared. The President, Emmanuel Macron, has promised it will be rebuilt within 5 years. BBC Paris correspondent Catherine Standerson has this report.
Hundreds joined together for a vigil on the banks of the Seine to show solidarity in the face of this most unexpected of traumas. They sang hymns and said prayers and paid tribute to the courage of those who worked so hard to save this world-famous landmark. Inside the 850-year-old cathedral, the damage is now on display for all to see. The fire took hold of the ancient building's roof, burning through hundreds of tons of oak in just a few hours, raining ash and embers onto the floor below and toppling the famous spire. 500 firefighters battled for 4 hours before managing to get the blaze under control. Another 30 minutes and the story would have been one of complete destruction, something Paris would have found difficult to bear.
You don't understand, you don't get it. How can that kind of thing can happen right now? It's impossible to accept that, so you just...
For the life of all the Parisians and even in Europe and in the world, it exists as a symbol and we need it.
Though the stone structure is still standing, there has been significant loss. As well as most of the roof, it's estimated between 5 and 10% of the precious artworks housed in the cathedral have gone. But the crown of thorns some believe was worn by Jesus on the cross, several important paintings, the medieval organ and the famous rose windows remain. And this most historic of buildings will be repaired.
And yes, we will rebuild the Notre Dame Cathedral, and it will be more beautiful than before, and it will be done in 5 years.
Hundreds of millions of euros have already been pledged to that cause. Notre Dame has survived, but is badly scarred, and thoughts now turn to what will be one of the world's most important restoration projects.
And that was the BBC's Catherine Sanderson there from Paris. And it seems the pre-Easter information dump is coming thick and fast today. The City Rail link revealed less than half an hour ago it was looking at $1 billion blowout. The country's largest ever transport project will now cost around $4.4 billion. Chief Executive Sean Sweeney explained his reaction to the budget overrun to reporters a short time ago.
I was pleased that we finally had an accurate line of sight on what the cost to complete might be.
Why was there never an accurate line of sight? I mean, Phil Twyford just put out a statement already saying that the previous government didn't set aside enough money. you've come into this project as its lead. Is that a fair assessment?
I couldn't comment. All I know is projects like this go from a period of great uncertainty about their costs to finally coming to some degree of certainty, and usually the first time you can get an accurate line of sight is when you've completed most of your procurement and you've completed your design, and we're at that point now. So I really think this is the first time the project can give an accurate advice as to the likely cost to complete. Before now, they would have been dealing with greatly uncertain information.
What would you say to the average, mum and dad watching the news tonight, thinking $1 billion is a lot of money, probably quite frustrated because of their taxes and their rates? What do you say to them to put them at ease about this $1 billion, well, they'll call it $1 billion blowout?
Well, I would say that this number has been thoroughly interrogated by the best people in this part of the globe, and independently by two different firms, and this number has come to us as a result of all the work we've done and they've done. So I think it's the first time we actually have a real sense of confidence about what a cost to complete number might be.
And that's Sean Sweeney there talking about the potential budget overrun of $1 billion for the Central Rail link in Auckland. Low vaccination rates for meningococcal disease have health authorities in Northland fearing the worst with winter on the way. Despite an intensive emergency program over summer, they've managed to immunise only 63% of those eligible for free shots. And they say anti-vax campaigners are partly to blame. Lois Williams reports.
Nick Chamberlain is a worried man. The chief executive of Northland Health says the DHB's thrown everything into its campaign to protect people from the new deadly W strain of the meningococcus bacterium. 3 people died of it in the north last year, and a Hokianga baby fell ill but recovered just last month. Since November, when the Ministry of Health officially declared an outbreak, 14,300 children and young people in the region have had their free shots. There were queues for the vaccine on day one, but 4 months later, 37% of the eligible age groups remain unprotected.
I'm really worried not only for this program, because of course we've got winter coming up from a meningococcal W point of view again, and we probably haven't hit a high enough percentage to provide what's called herd immunity, that is immunity to the rest of the population who aren't vaccinated.
Nick Chamberlain says part of the problem was the campaign's timing. The community clinics offering the vaccine to under 5s and teenagers started in December.
It was just before Christmas, and so then we went very hard for 3 weeks, from the 5th till just on Christmas. And then, of course, we had somewhat of a hiatus as people went on holiday. Schools were out at this time, so the timing was not ideal.
The head of Hokianga Health, John Wigglesworth, agrees. He says the group most at risk, older teenagers, tend to go AWOL as soon as school's out for summer, and in Hokianga they proved pretty elusive.
It was a difficult time to establish any kind of project that was targeting that age group, because they're kind of going all over the place at that time of year, so it's hard to do that. The figures that we did get, around about half and a bit more than half of the target was pretty good considering that timing.
But Nick Chamberlain says the campaign could not have started earlier. He says the Ministry of Health has fixed criteria for emergency vaccination programs. They're triggered when case numbers rise and an outbreak's declared. And in Northland, that didn't happen till mid-November. The Whangarei National MP, Shane Reti, who's a GP by trade, has a problem with that.
They knew the attack rate was over the 10 per 100,000 around about the middle of October. It then took 2 weeks for the ministry to gather together to people to declare it an outbreak. Those 2 weeks would have allowed the pharmaceutical companies to get the vaccines in quicker, would have allowed us to make a start while the school children, the older children, were still at school.
But Nick Chamberlain believes there's another factor at play here, and that's anti-vaccination sentiment. He says when the DHB has run emergency programs in the past for meningococcal outbreaks, the uptake's been much better. But ever since the notorious Vaxxed film was shown in the north, immunisation rates for all diseases have dropped. Dr Chamberlain says the filmmakers have a lot to answer for.
They really focused on Northland, started the Vaxxed movie in Northland, and then had many showings of that movie. And we saw almost immediately a drop in our immunisation rates, not to do with meningococcal disease, but our standard immunisation program, and it dropped about 5 or so percentage points, and we've tracked that since, and it really hasn't recovered.
Shane Reti says meningitis is a disease of the cold months, and it's a sinister sign that there's been one case diagnosed already in a warm autumn. Nick Chamberlain says Northland DHB is hanging on to its 13,000 unused doses of meningococcal W vaccine in the hope people will take more interest in protecting their children as winter progresses. In Whangarei for Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
Up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, hundreds of Housing New Zealand tenants evicted because of bogus meth tests will have some of their MSD debt scrapped. The string of failures that led to 55 patients being exposed to inadequately sterilised medical equipment in Hawke's Bay and doggy paddling for his life. The little pup rescued hundreds of kilometres out to sea. We'd love to hear from you. Give us your feedback on the capital gains tax or anything else that's on your mind from the programme today. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Now here's Susanna with the headlines.
In a shock announcement, the government has ruled out a capital gains tax, showing the power of coalition partner New Zealand First. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says Labour will not revisit imposing such a tax while she's the leader. Labour and the Greens both supported the tax working group's recommendations for taxing capital gains, but the coalition could not reach consensus. The working group's chair, Sir Michael Cullen, says New Zealand First objected to any form of capital gains tax and is responsible for today's decision. He says, while it's disappointing, the group's report made many other recommendations which the government is looking into. An extra $1 billion has been added to the budget of Auckland's underground city rail link, up from $3.4 to $4.4 billion. City Rail Link's chief executive Sean Sweeney says it's been bumped up by increased construction and contingency costs and the need to accommodate longer trains. A report into an incident in Hawke's Bay Hospital in February, in which 55 patients were exposed to unsterilised equipment, is blaming multiple errors and a lack of safeguards. The batch of equipment was used in operating theatres and sent out to outpatient clinics where it was used by district nurses. The investigation has found no one noticed the steriliser was not working and there was no cross-checking, follow-up auditing or regular maintenance of equipment. The Social Development Ministry will wipe the debts of Housing New Zealand tenants wrongly evicted from their homes due to a false meth testing regime. About 900 tenants were forced from their homes between 2013 and 2018, and some owed the Ministry money for emergency housing, moving costs, furniture and bond or rent. A group of climate change activists have poured 28 litres of sour milk on the steps of Parliament to symbolise the impact of dairy farming on waterways. 60 people from the climate change protest group Extinction Rebellion gathered to demand the government raise the country's fresh water quality standards. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen and Madison Reedy has joined me in the studio to talk business. New inflation figures out today. How is it looking, Madison?
This is the Consumer Price Index that landed today. It rose ever so slightly, just 0.1%. That's in the 3 months to March. Now, that takes annual inflation to 1.5%. Now, that's actually down on the previous 3-month quarter, where it was 1.9%. Now, this result was below expectations. The market consensus expectation was a 0.3% rise, and the Reserve Bank expected slightly lower, a 0.2% rise. They're obviously targeting that 2% midpoint inflation figure. Now, Statistics New Zealand said that this cooler result than expected was down to a huge rise in cigarette prices. Now, cigarettes rose 9% in the past 3 months. Now, that was induced by a rise in the tobacco excise tax in January, one of many that we've seen over the past couple of years. So one cigarette now costs $1.50. A decade ago, it cost $1.50. A decade ago, it cost just 54 cents. And even 3 years ago, at the start of 2016, one cigarette cost $1.15. So there's some handy inflation figures for you. Food prices also rose in the quarter, as did housing costs, which we know they've both been rising pretty steadily. But interestingly, when you actually take cigarettes out of the picture, inflation in this consumer price index actually fell by the same amount, by that 0.1% figure. Now, that's because of falls in petrol prices. Obviously, they've been rising of late. late with the likes of the regional fuel tax in Auckland and high oil prices offshore, but they actually fell in particularly January and February. So for the quarter, they were down 7%. Also, international airfares were down 12% in the quarter. That's pretty much a seasonal change. They usually do come off a bit in the start of the year. Now, the Economist's reaction to this one, ANZ, the country's largest bank, they say that the outlook is troubling. They're suggesting that this means that the domestic economy is running out of steam. A pretty similar note there from ASB. They say that the economy looks increasingly unlikely to be able to generate sufficient momentum. And although they do say Westpac had a slightly different note there, they said that the Reserve Bank could actually look through this result. So that's different to what ASB said. ASB are expecting that the Reserve Bank will will cause an official cash rate cut in May next month. They reckon that's on the cards, but Westpac says possibly not so likely.
Okay, a reputation index, we have such a thing, and has revealed what businesses New Zealanders like and dislike.
Exactly. So this is a research firm called Reputation Institute, a pretty obvious one what they do. They've created a list, they actually do it annually, of the 25 companies and how they rank based on their reputation. So at the top of this year's list was Toyota, number 1, in New Zealand, and the Warehouse Group. Now the top two there, Toyota and our national carrier airline in New Zealand, they've pretty much held those top 2 spots for a very long time. At the bottom of the heap was Fletcher Building, the construction company, and ExxonMobil, the oil company. In the middle of the list, though, interestingly, the banks, the major banks, particularly the Australian-owned banks, took a bit of a hammering. So BNZ, Westpac and ANZ all fell. ANZ fell the most by 12 points, from 4th place down to 16th place in just 1 year. It's a pretty large move. ASB did stay steady, though, at 6th place. Now, this is obviously a direct result of the Royal Commission of Inquiry across the Tasman in Australia. Now, that found widespread misconduct among these Australian-owned banks' parent companies, and this is proof that their reputations have obviously been damaged in New Zealand, despite a review by regulators here finding that there was no widespread misconduct among their New Zealand-based subsidiaries. But we should also note that this was actually to the benefit of New Zealand's, of the largest New Zealand-owned bank, Kiwibank. They actually debuted on the list for the first time in 4th place.
Wow. What happened on the markets today?
The NZX Top 50 index rose by 0.75%. That's a rise of 74 points to close at 9,982 points tonight. The dollar is trading at 67.3 US cents, 93.6 to the Australian, and 51.6 British pence. Our currency was down about 1% against most of our major currencies after that consumer price index news this afternoon, but it has recovered a little bit since then.
Thank you. That's Madison Reedy, business reporter. Housing New Zealand tenants evicted over bogus meth contamination tests will have some of their debts wiped by the government. HNZ ended 800 tenancies over about 5 years based on a testing regime that was later debunked. Some of them were first forced to borrow money from the Ministry of Social Development for emergency accommodation and other expenses after they were kicked out, and they're still paying it back. Today, Social Development Minister Carmel Sepuloni announced debts accrued as a direct result of the meth evictions will be erased.
So there were about 782 people that held tenancies and then were wrongfully evicted. There were other adults that were living in those households as well. I think around about 1,300. But of that 1,300, we're talking about 900 of them have some debt with MSD that now we have to ascertain whether or not that was a result of the flawed methamphetamine policy that Housing New Zealand had at the time.
Do you have a ballpark figure for the debt they're holding?
Look, we know that the debt for those individuals equates to about 3.2 million, but not all of that debt would have been incurred as a result of the flawed policy of the time. And so now we have to work through this on a case-by-case basis.
So what does that mean actually in practical terms? Are you literally going through a case?
Literally ringing them. So starting today, MSD have identified those people and they are starting the proactive outreach to ring them and then to ascertain what their debt is, whether or not that was a result of the flawed Housing New Zealand policy, and where it was, we will be looking to wipe that debt.
So some of that $3.2 odd million may not be associated with the meth evictions.
That's right.
So what's the criteria for deciding what is a cost that has been incurred as a result of the eviction?
Sure. So I can't outline every individual case that will come about, but some examples might be that they had to get bond, that they had to get moving costs supported from MSD, that they had to get recoverable costs in those forms as a result of the eviction. So those are two examples where there could have been a direct impact on the debt that they have with MSD, and so that is the type of debt that we're looking at wiping.
I know from information provided to RNZ that MSD prior to October 2016 recorded information in a different way. And recorded special needs grants in a different way. Are you sure that you have identified everybody who may be entitled to have debt removed?
Look, I've been given that assurance, and so I'm going to have faith in the process. They'll start the phone calls, as I said, as of today, and I expect that it will be a robust process, that they will be assessing and ascertaining and having the conversations that need to be had to ensure that they get this right.
You've spoken before about kind of the burden of beneficiaries carrying big debt loads. I mean, what would you say to these people who have had the stress of having debt, which isn't their fault? What would you say to them?
Oh, look, I'd say to them, look, we're going to do what we can to fix what was a wrong situation. It was a flawed policy. It was a Housing New Zealand policy that had an impact in other aspects of their life. MSD is one of those areas where they may have incurred debt. What we can do here is look to wipe that debt. So we can't fix the 6 years of that policy and all the stress that it would have caused those families, but what we can do is address the one thing that we have oversight of, and that is the debt that they would have incurred as a result of that flawed policy.
So Housing New Zealand announced compensation in September of last year, so that's more than 6 months ago now. Why has it taken so long to get this done? Oh, look, we've got to make sure that we get these things right. 6 months to some may not be seem ideal in terms of could it have been done sooner. The main thing is that we get this right. I think that 6 months to develop what we're going to do here in a plan of action is actually okay in terms of the announcements and everything that's been made, and so now we'll take the next few months to make those individual phone calls, and we should have this sorted by mid-year. So some people will have paid back debt over a number of years. As well as wiping the debt, are you going to reimburse the people the payments that they've already made?
If they had debt that then they made repayments on, that was a direct result of the eviction that came from the flawed policy, then yes, we will be looking to refund them.
Will there be any further compensation for them if you've had that money for a number of years? You know, they could have earned interest, they could have spent it.
Look, we're just looking to wipe the debt that's been incurred and to repay them if they have made repayments that was as a result of the flawed policy.
You will be aware that the National Party has previously said when it comes to compensation, the Housing New Zealand compensation, they said it was payments for meth crooks. So, can you guarantee in refunding this money to people that you are indeed not benefiting people who have actually committed crimes?
Look, the reality is that the science now shows us that the bar was set so low that actually there is no proof that those families that were evicted were actually smoking pee in those houses. And so to punish them when actually there was no proof that actually they were doing that is wrong, and we can't allow that to happen.
But you can't actually guarantee that there won't be a few people caught up in this that benefit from it, even though they were doing wrong in these houses.
Oh, look, you also can't guarantee that they were doing wrong, and so because there's no proof of that, then they shouldn't be punished.
How many of these evicted tenants actually ended up in emergency accommodation?
I don't know exactly the number that ended up in emergency accommodation, but we could get those figures for you.
Okay.
We do know that of the 3.27 million that they have in debt, only about, well, when I say only, I don't think that's the right word to use, but about 360,000 was actually emergency housing special needs grants.
Okay, so how many of the evicted tenants are still in emergency accommodation or, you know, on the waiting list to get back into a state house?
So I heard the most recent figure between February and March was that there were 30 who were evicted as part of the flawed meth policy from Housing New Zealand that are still in emergency housing.
Well, what would you say to them?
Oh, look, that we need to be working with them as hard as we can to get them into more permanent housing.
But they're in this form of housing through no fault of their own, and they're still waiting.
Look, Lisa, you know, as has been said before, when we came into government 17 months ago, we were facing a housing crisis. And so within the last 17 months, we haven't been able to meet the demand that we need to in this country. So we've got a lot of time to make up for, and we're doing the best that we can.
You've talked about wiping debt before. Not just in relation to people who have been evicted because of these bogus meth tests. In the lead up to the election, you said that debt was an incredible burden on beneficiaries, and you believe that debt should be wiped. Are you going to do that?
Yeah, and we've had this conversation before, Lisa.
We have.
Yeah.
So what is the answer?
As I said last time that we were interviewed about this, the legislation's really clear. Where the debt was incurred due to a fault of the government, then that is, in those instances, the debt can be wiped. The reality is that for a period of time, there was an emergency housing policy that meant that a large number of people were incurring debt, but unfortunately, that debt was incurred under a policy that existed at the time.
Minister, you change laws all the time, and you managed to change one in just a couple of weeks recently. So if you wanted to do this, you could. Is it not a priority for you anymore?
Priority is addressing the debt, and I think we'll be having more discussions about that moving forward, that people hold that go through the welfare system. And so I think debt is something that we need to be looking at in terms of things like income
adequacy. That's off the agenda for you, though. That's off the agenda for you, wiping debt, which is something that you articulated prior to the election and may have driven some people to vote for you.
Wiping the debt that you're talking about, Lisa, is off the agenda.
Which obviously brings us to the Welfare Advisory Group. What have they told you about the levels of debt beneficiaries are carrying and how you best deal with that?
You'll find out, Lisa, when we release that document. What I can say is that a date has been confirmed for May the 3rd.
That's when
we will be releasing
the advisory group's paper will be released in its entirety?
We will be releasing that report.
Can you tell us what they say about benefit levels?
I can tell you what they say on May the 3rd.
And that's Carmel Sepuloni, and the first debts that are going to be wiped should be wiped within the next fortnight. And as the Minister mentioned there, the welfare reform report from the advisory group is being released on May 3rd. A top military attaché that planted a covert camera in an embassy bathroom, or a man caught in a web of unfortunate but innocent coincidences. Those are the two theories presented in Alfred Keating's trial, which is drawing to a close at the Auckland District Court. Annika Smith has been covering the trial and filed this report.
Crown Prosecutor Henry Steele began his closing remarks this morning by telling the jury Alfred Keating was not a victim of circumstance.
Two possibilities present themselves to us. Either he's been absurdly unlucky and finds himself the victim of a remarkable series of unfortunate but ultimately innocent coincidences, or Commodore Alfred Keating, Defence Attaché to the United States, is the bloke who put the camera in the toilet.
Mr Keating has been on trial for 2 weeks now, accused of planting a covert camera in a bathroom in the New Zealand Embassy in Washington, D.C. It's the Crown's case that the 59-year-old was trying to film his colleagues on the toilet, while the defence has argued his absolute innocence. Mr Steele said the cumulative weight of the evidence proved Mr Keating's guilt.
Now, yes, each of these coincidences I've mentioned, each of these pieces of evidence on its own warrants suspicion. But the effect of the evidence in this case is cumulative, elevating that suspicion to proof beyond reasonable doubt when we consider the evidence as a whole.
During the course of the trial, the court has heard a DNA profile found on the covert camera's memory card was 10,000 million times more likely to be Mr Keating's than a random New Zealander's. Last week, the jury heard Mr Keating's personal laptop had at one time been connected to a Brickhouse security camera, though the Crown couldn't prove it was the same camera found in the bathroom. It also heard his laptop had Googled modes and switch positions just 2 days before the covert camera was found. The jurors were played a series of video files recovered on the device, including a video which showed an unidentified person wearing blue latex gloves planting the camera. It's the Crown's case that Mr Keating was filmed setting up the motion-activated camera and then remained in the bathroom to be filmed a second time using the toilet.
But then why make the second video? Why would you do that? Well, perhaps plausible deniability. Knows the camera is motion-activated, has been careful to ensure he's not in the first video. He wants to set himself up as the first victim. Maybe it's all part of the thrill. Maybe he just finished the setup and needs to go to the bathroom. Who knows?
Yesterday, Mr Keating's defence lawyer, Ron Mansfield, said the attache's driver, Mike Waller, was responsible for the covert camera, something he vehemently denied and which Mr Steele said was implausible. Mr Mansfield began his closing remarks by drawing parallels between the embassy's management and BBC's comedy TV series Dad's Army.
Sadly, the words inept and incomplete are the only appropriate ways to describe the management of the event on the 27th of July in 2017 and following.
He told the jury the DNA evidence had been contaminated and couldn't be relied on, going further to say critical evidence had been entirely missed.
Key evidence has been lost by that inept and incomplete management and investigation. And what you're left with, folks, is a very incomplete picture of what could have been gathered if this item was treated as it should have been. We should, as a community, expect better.
Mr Mansfield said there was a real risk that after years of service, Mr Keating would face injustice. He told the jury significant holes and deficiencies in the Crown's case meant the jury couldn't be assured of his guilt. Judge Robert Renane will sum up the case tomorrow morning before the jury retires to deliberate. Ātuiti ko te atamaki, ko Annika Smith aho.
It is 9 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keep your feedback coming. We're getting lots of it on the capital gains tax, or lack of it. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. 55 Hawke's Bay patients who were exposed to unsterilised medical equipment will have to wait until August to be certain they haven't been infected with blood-borne viruses like hepatitis B, hepatitis C and HIV. An independent report released today has identified a series of gaps and errors, including lack of maintenance or auditing and confusion around which equipment was still dirty, which may have exposed some staff to risk. Dr Robin Wyman is the Chief Medical and Dental Officer at Hawke's Bay District Health Board. Ruth Hill asked him whether this may have happened before this incident came to light in February.
We haven't got any evidence that other loads hadn't been sterilised. We have been back through the electronic records of the autoclaves. But when you've got a system problem like this, it is possible, and I think that that's what the independent review has pointed out, that there could be strengthening of the process, not just at Hawke's Bay, but at DHBs across the country, by stronger tracking and tracing of the sterile instruments, and at actually having a level of external and internal auditing of these processes. So I think it's possible, but we don't have evidence of it here in Hawke's Bay at this stage.
So tell me, what have you done about it?
So since the time of the event, we have changed the process in our sterile services department to make sure that a printer, which wasn't functioning on the autoclave on the night in question, has been replaced, and that there's been some maintenance to that autoclave to make it much clearer that when the start button is started on that autoclave, it's clear to the technician that that's actually happened. And we've done a lot of training with both our staff in the sterile services department, but also across the various departments of the hospital, theatre and outpatient departments, to make sure that people are aware of the change that needs to have happened on the packets for it to be clear that they've actually been sterilised and are sterile at that point.
This was only picked up because a theatre nurse noticed that the colour coding was incorrect. Isn't that right? That
theatre pack has a change in the colour of the stripes on it, which is pretty easy to see, and that was picked up absolutely by a nurse in theatre. There were also quite a lot of packs with smaller instruments in small packs, and one of the issues that's been identified is that the change on those packs to identify that they've been sterilised. There's a more subtle change on a strip down the side of the pack, and that appears to have been a contributory part of the problem.
I mean, if the nurse hadn't seen that, do you think nobody would have realised?
That is the potential end, although I think with the large theatre packs, it is more likely it would have been picked up. I mean, the nurse did a very good job in terms of identifying the issue, but if that hadn't been picked up, then a load could have passed all the way through and as an ultimate end of this year.
So what of the patients themselves? 55 patients affected. You have tested all of them now? I think 24 weeks is the end point, isn't it, when they will be totally in the clear?
All of those patients have been contacted. All of them have been offered, and most have taken up individual appointments with our consultant physician in the hospital who runs that clinic, and have had individual health advice to them and immunisations if they wish to. And yes, you're right, they will continue to be tested through to the middle of the year. 6 months is the period until all of that's resolved. Apart from the fact we apologise to all the patients who've been affected, and that we understand the upset and the concern. We work very hard to make sure everybody has individual contact, and that's a really important part of this for people. And I think also that, we do understand the fact this is fundamental to people's confidence in the system, and we're working to put the corrections in place that we need to.
And that was Dr Robin Wyman, who's the Chief Medical and Dental Officer at Hawke's Bay District Health Board, and he was speaking to our reporter Ruth Hill. A Central Otago community's hard work has paid off with the opening of a new multi-million-dollar hospital. Residents gathered outside the new facility in Ranfurly after years of fundraising and campaigning to build it. The revamped Maniatoto Hospital, which includes 29 new beds, begins a new era of medical treatment in the region. Our Otago Southland reporter Tess Brunton was in Ranfurly.
The Maniatoto has a long history of community-led medical initiatives. Local farmer and former hospital board member Gerald Dowling says the new $7 million medical facility is the fourth for the region. The first started in a hotel bar.
And it was the top hotel in Naseby, the ancient Britain, and it's said that the front room was a morgue when necessary, was the doctor's rooms when they called every time they could call to see patients, and had quite a colourful history. But the Ancient Britain Hotel still stands proud in Naseby.
Mr Dowling hopes the new hospital will help keep people in the community.
Without good and permanent everyday healthcare services in your community, young folk, young children or older folk who need constant care can't stay in the community where their families are. So it's very important to have your local health services available every day of the year.
The community set a high target, but over the last couple of years, $7 million has been raised with help from a $1 million grant from the government and financial support from the Central Otago District Council. The hospital is run by charitable organisation Maniatoto Health Services. Services Chairman Stuart Patterson says after working under very ordinary conditions, the medical staff are thrilled to be in the new hospital, as are the patients.
Things have moved quickly since we had a public meeting in the Town Hall in October 2016. 200 people attended and we put the proposal of a new building to them. The meeting was very supportive and the community got right in behind the project, and I think that just about every fundraising project there's been since then has been for this hospital.
For people on the Maniatoto, the new hospital is invaluable. The nearest medical facility is about an hour away on roads that can be cut off from snow or fog. Their new hospital includes more beds and transforms their existing rest home facilities into a medical centre and community service facility. Central Otago District Mayor Tim Cadogan says the hospital will be an asset for the community for years to come.
I loved coming over the hill today, over the Ida Valley, and the fog was over the Ida, and it's just every time I stop and I just can't believe I'm the mayor of this place and that we all get to share in it. But there's the beauty of the Maniatoto, but then there's the people and the community that's come forward and the manner that it has to allow this organisation to build this building for the people.
More than 100 residents showed their support for the new building, cheering as it was opened.
You're going to do a three-way handshake now. Only one person. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. It's my very real privilege to declare this facility open. Hooray.
Health Minister David Clark officially cut the ribbon, saying the community should be proud they made their dream a reality.
I have to say that as Health Minister, this is one of my favourite jobs.
There is not a long line of people who queue up to be the health minister. But on a day like this, it's pretty special to celebrate the efforts of a community who've come together to make real a dream of providing quality health services for their community.
The work is not over yet. A helipad, doctors' rooms, plunket and dentist are part of the Stage 2 development underway now. In Ranfurly for Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton Tane.
Just enough time for a quick bit of feedback before the news. Capital gains tax. This from Grant. Absolutely chuffed there is no capital gains tax, he says. We are overtaxed now. Murray, though, says disappointed that such an opportunity to move to an equitable spread of society's costs has been so poorly handled by all parties. And this one, the old fly in the ointment or wasp in the beehive, New Zealand first.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātawa tēnei. The Prime Minister has ruled out any kind of capital gains tax in a surprise move that shows the power of her coalition partner New Zealand First. Jacinda Ardern made the announcement this afternoon, nearly 2 months after the tax working group recommended a comprehensive tax on businesses, farms and second homes. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
Ultimately, New Zealand First put the kibosh on a CGT. It's long opposed the policy, and Labour and the Greens failed to win them over. Jacinda Ardern says she's disappointed, but accepts she doesn't have the political or public mandate to push forward. As such, she's also taken the dramatic step to take the tax off the table for as long as she is leader. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters says he opposed the tax because it was too complex and wouldn't achieve its stated purpose. But he says the coalition government will still work to make the tax system fairer. From Parliament, Craig McCulloch.
The chairman of the tax working group says he doesn't think he will see a capital gains tax in his lifetime. Sir Michael Cullen says New Zealand First objected to any form of the tax. He told Checkpoint the party's voter base are older, often Pākehā and own land. Sir Michael says it's a lost opportunity.
I think it'll be quite some time before people come back to this, and if and when we do, probably the demographic factors will be even less in favour of getting support for it because we will have an older population.
But Sir Michael disagrees that his tax working group report has been a waste of time and says there are a lot of other recommendations that the government is looking into. The country's largest ever transport project, Auckland's underground City Rail Link, will cost $1 billion more than planned. The City Rail Link's chief executive, Sean Sweeney, today announced the project will now cost $4.4 billion. Dr. Sweeney says the $1 billion increase is due to increased construction costs, contingency costs and a decision to accommodate longer trains. But he says this is probably the first accurate costing of the project.
Projects like this go from a period of great uncertainty about their costs to finally coming to some degree of certainty, and usually the first time you can get an accurate line of sight is when you've completed most of your procurement and you've completed your design, and we're at that point now. So I really think this is the first time the project can give an accurate advice as to the likely cost to complete.
Sean Sweeney. It's now up to the Crown and Auckland Council to approve the revised budget. Last month, CRL assured the government it is on track for completion by 2024, despite problems with its previous contractors. Northland DHB says immunisation rates in the region have dropped with the spread of anti-vaccination sentiment. Only 63% of eligible children have been vaccinated against the new deadly W strain of meningococcal disease, despite an intensive community campaign over summer. The DHB's General Manager, Nick Chamberlain, says that's significantly lower than the response to emergency meningococcal campaigns in 2005 and 2012, and not high enough to protect the community at large. Dr. Chamberlain says the anti-immunisation film Vaxxed is partly to blame. He says after it was launched in the far north last year, immunisation rates in the north dropped from over 90% to 85% and have never recovered. The DHB manager says Northland children are now more vulnerable, not just to meningitis, but to all infectious diseases, including measles. Health officials in Hawke's Bay can't rule out whether other patients may have been exposed to unsterilised medical equipment before an incident in February. An external report released today has found that multiple errors and system problems led to 55 patients being put at risk after a staff member in the sterilisation unit failed to press a machine's start button. A printer attached to the steriliser, which was supposed to record the process, had been broken for months. The Chief Officer for Medical and And Dental, Dr Robin Wyman, says staff have been back through the electronic records and there's no evidence that other loads had not been sterilised.
When you've got a system problem like this, it is possible, and I think that that's what the independent review has pointed out, that there could be strengthening of the process, not just at Hawke's Bay, but at DHBs across the country.
Robin Wyman says the Health Board has since upgraded its electronic tracking system for reusable medical devices and carried out staff training. Crowds are starting to arrive at Christchurch Stadium for the Aroha Nui You Are Us fundraiser concert. Artists including Lord, Dave Dobbin, 660 and Shapeshifter will be performing from 7 o'clock and up to 20,000 people are expected. It's the second of two charity concerts for those affected by the mosque terror attacks. The first was held in Auckland on Saturday. The proceeds will go into the Our People, Our City Fund and be distributed with guidance from the Muslim community. It's 6:05. An apologetic Mark Rudin says he's walking away from the Wellington Phoenix coaching job purely for family reasons. 2 days after the club confirmed Rudin will only see out 1 year of his 2-year contract, he has publicly spoken on his departure. He says he realised he'd have to leave the club when his family returned home to Sydney after the Christmas holidays. Rudin says living by himself in New Zealand is causing a strain on his relationship with his wife and 2 children who remained in Australia.
My intentions were good. It was to try and convince them to come over and stay. I love this place. You know, I've got a son that's a type 1 diabetic. It's not easy. You need a support network around you as well. I don't talk about these kind of things. They're all personal issues, but, you know, I'm not there for that. You know, my wife hasn't slept 8 hours a night for 10 years. She's continually checking his numbers and testing him and things like that. That puts a strain on your family.
Mark Rudin. The Phoenix play 6th placed Melbourne City on Sunday. The Chiefs have been dealt another blow after losing All Black Damien McKenzie for the rest of the season. They'll also be without All Black forwards Brodie Retallick and Nathan Harris for their match against the South African side, the Lions, in Hamilton Friday night. McKenzie ruptured knee ligaments in the Chiefs' narrow win against the Blues last weekend, while Retallick and Harris were also injured. Retallick suffered a shoulder injury but had been expected to play. However, he's now injured a hand at training and has been ruled out. That's the news.
Making calls?
Well, we had discussions about it at Cabinet, but no decisions have been made.
Making claims?
Many of the things in the Minister's letter are old stories from the last board.
And getting in touch.
They are rather hard to get hold of. You can't even email them. They don't have an email address. It's unbelievable.
Stay in touch. Morning Report, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, families with au pairs say new qualification requirements for home-based educators will impact on them unfairly. And after 10, guardian of some of New Zealand's rarest plants, Roatoria's Graham Atkins. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Great Barrier Island and Coromandel Peninsula, fine but isolated showers developing this evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mostly cloudy, occasional showers clearing south of the Wairoa district. For the remainder of the North Island, mainly fine, cloudy in Wellington, Wairarapa and Taihape morning and night. And for the South Island, fine apart from areas of cloud or fog morning and night, a few showers about the fiords tomorrow. Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy with a few showers. It's coming up to 8 minutes past 6. You're with RNZ National.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. New Zealand First has torpedoed the proposed capital gains tax. This afternoon, Jacinda Ardern announced not only will the government not take up the tax working group's recommendation, but the tax will be dropped for as long as she is the Labour leader. The Prime Minister noted that Labour has campaigned on introducing a CGT for the last 3 elections.
We have tried to build a mandate, but ultimately have been unsuccessful. For that reason, I am today setting out that for certainty's sake, that under my leadership, we will no longer campaign for or implement a capital gains tax. Not because I don't believe in it, but because I don't believe New Zealand does.
One party certainly doesn't believe in a capital gains tax, and that's New Zealand First. Here's how Winston Peters explained the party's decision to reporters.
The Prime Minister said clearly she discerned that there wasn't sufficient support in the country. But that's a political reality we have to face. And that was our view, but we were happy to see the public dialogue and discussion for the last 3 months. And here, barely the middle of April, we've come with our response.
Were you ever going to agree to a capital gain tax, though?
Look, we were happy to look at it very, very carefully and look at the international examples. But we said at the very beginning, you recall, there's not going to be an explosion in the accountancy or valuation professions. We're not going to listen to the scaremongering and shroud waving of some political entities and others in this country. And we're going to deliver you a simple taxation regime, and we have.
Winston Peters hasn't responded to Checkpoint's interview requests tonight. The Green Party leaders also weren't available to front tonight, but in February, James Shaw laid down a challenge, asking whether the government deserved to be re-elected if it didn't introduce a capital gains tax. Here's what he told Morning Report's Guyon Espiner.
We were elected on a platform of change, right, and really significant change. And it's all three parties of government campaigned on a platform of, in particular, cleaning up our rivers, ending child poverty in this country and so on. And you cannot do that without significant change to the tax system. Under the current system, someone who earns the median wage, about $45,000 a year, over 10 years, accumulates about earns about $450,000, pays about $70,000 in tax. Someone who managed to buy a house 10 years ago can sell that for $450,000, as much as that other person has earned in 10 years, and pay no tax on that. Fundamentally, that is why we have a wealth gap in New Zealand. So what I'm saying is, we were elected to address that wealth gap, and that involves fundamental reform of the tax system.
So you are saying, effectively, don't vote for this government unless there's a capital gains tax?
Well, no, what I was saying is that...
effectively that is, because I've read the Hansard. You're saying that the government doesn't deserve to be re-elected.
I said if we don't introduce the reforms that we were elected to make, the question isn't, should we, can we get away with, passing this? The question is, should we be re-elected if we don't introduce the reforms that we promised?
And what's the answer to your question?
Well, ultimately that's up to the voters to decide. But I fundamentally believe, and I've always believed, and the Green Party has advocated since we first entered Parliament, that tax reform has to be part of ensuring that the wealth gap, which is growing in this country, is addressed fundamentally.
James Shaw speaking there to Guyon Espiner in February. So we've heard plenty from some politicians today about the merits or otherwise of introducing a capital gains tax. But what do people outside the beehive think about the proposal being scrapped? Nita Blake-Person went to find out.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she's not scrapping a capital gains tax because she doesn't believe in it, but because she doesn't believe New Zealanders do. It was a shock revelation to some Labour voters who had been holding out hope for a capital gains tax under her leadership. Deb Hardwick is a call centre administrator in Hamilton. She expected at least a watered-down capital gains tax would get across the line and says Labour has let itself down.
It really wasn't what Labour came in to do. Labour's platform was a very strong moral platform to improve lives for people and to focus on lifting the standard of living for people who were, disadvantaged. And there's an increasing number of people who are in that boat.
Ms Hardwick says it sends a clear message to those who are struggling.
I feel as if they've just walked away and they said, OK, well, we've really got to put business first and we'll let someone else, multinationals, they can pick up the tab and we'll go after people like that. But when it comes down to it, it's really, really going to promote the business and other people will just have to come along as best they can. And I think that that's not what Labour was all about.
But Auckland cafe owner Lisa Prager says she's incredibly grateful to the Prime Minister for walking away from the tax, which she says would have had dire consequences for her business.
It would have meant there was no point in us being in business. We operate on such fine margins that, when the time comes to sell the business, there's just nothing there. There's no point. And so you have to ask yourself, why work all these years if there's really nothing at the end of it?
She appreciates that Jacinda Ardern's hand may have been forced by New Zealand First, but says small businesses are struggling and scrapping the proposed tax was the right move.
As Jacinda said in her speech, that this wasn't about the housing market issue, this was about fairness. And the tax system in New Zealand really does hit the small business and farmers pretty hard. I mean, we can't sustain any more than we're already paying. I think that they're right to go after the large multinationals who have the skill, the ability, the accountants and lawyers to avoid tax.
Steve Wynne Harris is a sheep and beef farmer in Hawke's Bay. He was always sceptical that the tax would be adopted, but says some farmers were very concerned.
No, I wasn't intending to be selling land. We have a trust, and it would have been the next generation would be farming the land. So personally, it wasn't going to have any effect on me. But yeah, I think there will be some people in the rural sector relieved that it's not going to happen.
Aaron Whiteford is a postgraduate student in Wellington. He thought a capital gains tax would be introduced and believes it's a missed opportunity to create a more equal society.
Farmers have a lot of power. Those with houses and older generations have a lot of power. And maybe it's the fault of the young generations for not doing enough to make their voices heard. But it definitely doesn't support a change in trying to bring down increasing inequality and increasing house prices. Definitely, there's no forward steps to try and change that at all.
The government spent nearly $2 million commissioning a tax working group to look at a range of tax options, including a capital gains tax. The Prime Minister maintains it was a valuable exercise and says the majority of recommendations, other than a capital gains tax, will be further investigated. For Checkpoint, Cornita Blake-Person-Aho.
And let's delve into the very mixed bag of feedback on capital gains tax. David from Titirangi says, give ourselves a pat on the back. Kiwis, if you thought we were a greedy, selfish lot, our reaction to capital gains tax has proved you correct. This one from Stephen. Stephen says the rights of all hard-working New Zealanders who have provided for their future is once again secure, and the politics of envy is rightfully back in its box with the lock firmly shut. Marianne from Wutchuaika, though, has a different view. So disappointed in this government not going ahead with capital gains tax. We need more taxes to run this country, not to mention deal with climate change. Where is the money going to come from, if not from taxes? We want it all, says Marianne, but we don't want to pay for it. And this one from Philip, who says, I'm hugely disappointed that the CGT has been dumped and angry that it is on the account of a party polling at a measly 4%. Winston Peters conducts himself as if it were 40%, says Philip. So much for Kiwis being champions of fairness. Greed wins again. This person massively disappointed about the capital gains tax. Big lose for salary and wage earners who can't claim deductions in expenses while capital assets remain immune. They go on to say, it does surprise me that most people disagree when so many of those probably do not have any capital assets anyway. And also this one, true story. This is not me telling the true story, someone who's written into us. True story. I have inherited $150,000 from my elderly parents. Was waiting till a CGT decision was made before I decided what to do with it. Stick it in the stock market or buy a house. Now I think I'll buy a house and rent it out. Bad for the country, great for me, says this person. That's the sad reality of the flow of capital, Grant and Jacinda. Richard says all the Nats with all their properties will be happy. One of the only countries in the world without a CGT. Disappointed, says Richard. Hopefully we'll get to more of your feedback. Thanks for sending it in. The world's largest single-day election is underway. The polls have opened in Indonesia, where more than 190 million people are eligible to vote across almost 1,000 inhabited islands. President Joko Widodo is being challenged by a former general, Prabowo Subianto. People are also voting for many thousands of candidates in legislative elections. The ABC's Anne Barker is in Jakarta and has this report.
Whoever wins or loses today, the election process itself is a major feat of democracy. Electoral authorities have spent more than $2 billion to reach voters in every far-flung corner of this vast country. The sheer number of polling booths, 810,000, is designed to maximise turnout and eliminate any chance of vote rigging during or after the ballot. We've registered 249 voters at this booth. One election worker says we're expecting about 90% of voters to turn out. Almost universally, political observers like Marcus Mietzner from the ANU believe Joko Widodo, the popular down-to-earth president, will easily fend off his rival Prabowo Subianto.
If Prabowo wins, it would be a major upset, and that's why I think it's not going to happen. Jokowi is going to win. The question is what the margin will be.
But the margin of victory could mean the difference between a smooth transition or violence on the streets. Prabowo Subianto, the volatile ex-military general, has already railed about voting irregularities on the electoral roll. He's warned of mass protests and a legal challenge if there's even a hint of vote rigging. Protests that political analysts like Kevin O'Rourke say could drag on for months.
Because officials from the Constitutional Court have said publicly that their date for resolving the presidential electoral dispute is not until 8 August. So that's more than 3 months away. So that would be a prolonged period.
It's exactly what happened in 2014 when Prabowo Subianto challenged the last election result but ultimately lost. And regardless of which side wins, there are broader questions about the future of democracy itself. One global index ranks Indonesia as a flawed democracy, citing a decline in political rights and civil liberties, including freedom of speech, since Joko Widodo came to power. Others fear the creeping return of military leaders into quasi-government roles, though one long-term commentator, Dewi Fortuna Anwar, believes democracy in Indonesia remains secure.
The majority of Indonesians firmly believe in democracy as the best and only acceptable form of governance, and people are not going to give that up very, very easily.
With polls due to close at 1 p.m. local time, the first results could be known by this afternoon.
And that was Anne Barker there from Jakarta. Auckland's Mayor Phil Goff says officials are already working on ways to avoid raising rates to cover a $1 billion cost blowout on the City Rail Link project. This afternoon, the head of the project announced the anticipated cost of the finished rail link would be almost $4.5 billion, $1 billion more than the 2014 estimate. The project is being jointly funded by the Crown and Auckland Council. Auckland Mayor Phil Goff says the rail link needs to go ahead, but he's told officials he doesn't want the burden to be added to rates. He told reporters that officials have come up with 5 solutions, including selling off council assets like CBD car parks and renegotiating loans.
Anybody that has a mortgage understands that when you take out a mortgage, you might forgo an overseas holiday, or you might forgo a second car or a better car. Everybody knows that there's big demand, but only a limited income to pay for it, and that you have to choose and choose wisely between your priorities. I don't think Aucklanders will challenge the choice that Council is likely to make on this. I say likely to make because the decision needs formally to be taken by our governing body, and that will occur in early May.
Confident?
That will go through? Yes, because the option of not proceeding with the CRL doesn't make sense to anyone, Aucklanders or councillors. The option of not future-proofing it doesn't make sense to anyone. And the need to have ways of decongesting our city when more and more people are living here and there are more and more cars on the road is obvious to all. I think that Aucklanders will regard this as a critical part of the infrastructure we need to decongest our city.
Are you confident it's going to be on time? That won't be delayed?
The answer, when I asked that question to the Chief Executive of the City Rail Link, was that he anticipated that this job would be done by the last quarter of 2024, which is the milestone that we have set for him.
You say you're confident in these new numbers. Do you have any concerns it's going to blow out again? And if it did, will the council actually be able to put more money forward again? Because the number's getting high.
I expect City Rail Link to deliver on the timing and the cost of the project as it's currently set up. I am confident that their process in arriving at that cost is a thorough one, done with integrity and checked by international peer reviewers. So yes, I believe that they should and they must deliver at that cost and on that time frame.
Auckland Mayor Phil Goff. Thousands of people are expected to attend a fundraising concert in Christchurch tonight to raise money for those affected by the mosque attacks. It comes on the same day as the country's terrorism threat level was downgraded from its highest ever setting to medium. The concert is the second of 2 You Are Us concerts. The first was over the weekend in Auckland, where some of the best in New Zealand's music industry performed to a sellout crowd. Tonight, those artists are expected to be joined by Lord. Our reporter Logan Church is outside the stadium gates in the crowd and joins us now via live view. Hi Logan, what's it looking like there in terms of numbers?
Hi Lisa, yes, just over a month ago this was a city gripped in fear, but more a month on you cannot see any of that here tonight. So we've been here for a few hours just in front of Christchurch Stadium, and we have seen thousands of people stream through this area over the last few hours. Promoters estimate between 17 and 20,000 people are expected to attend the You Are Us concert, which is expected to get underway at about 7 o'clock. And what a concert it's expected to be. The best of New Zealand's music industry will be here. Stan Walker, 660, Marlon Williams are just some of the couple of dozen artists expected to turn up. We also understand that Lord will be making a special guest appearance. What's that special guest appearance is yet to be seen, but concert goers will certainly find out in the next few hours.
So how is security looking there?
Security, as you can imagine, is quite tight. I've been to a lot of events here at Christchurch Stadium. I've never seen security this type. If we go for a bit of a walk here, we're actually standing beside one of the gates. Armed police officers patrol this entire area. Just around the corner is their mobile command unit. Behind me, you might actually hear some beeping. Over here, just at the front of the gates, everyone is being searched by metal detectors. And as they come down the line here, tables are set up and every single bag that enters this stadium is being searched. Also, no bag over 30 centimetres by 30 centimetres is being allowed in. Those are being stored at a marquee just in front of me. So no one here is taking any chances. However, that's certainly not putting a bad spin on the mood tonight. There's certainly a lot of very happy, very excited people here.
Thanks, Logan. That's Logan Church, who is outside the You Are Us concert, which is the second concert fundraiser to raise money for those people affected by the mosque attacks. They call it dog paddle, and this next story gives it a whole new meaning. A dog has been rescued from the ocean, swimming 220 kilometres off the coast of Thailand. The exhausted brown aspen swam towards oil rig workers on a drilling platform yesterday. He's now been brought back to port and is being checked by a vet. The BBC's Tim Allman has the details.
Back on dry land, a miracle on 4 legs. This little chap has been named Boonrod, a Thai word that roughly translates as the saved one. We can say that again. He looks okay now, a little dehydrated, but basically all right. It was a very different story a day earlier. Boonrod was pulled on board an oil rig in the Gulf of Thailand. Bedraggled and exhausted, the animal had been found swimming in the water. Where he came from, how he got there, and how long he was in the sea, no one knows. There's been some speculation he may have fallen off a fishing trawler. Whatever the answer, this was quite a feat of doggy paddling. After his rescue, Boonrod was transferred onto a ship and brought to port in southern Thailand. When he's completely recovered and given the all clear, he will then be moved to a new home in the northeast of the country, about as far away from the sea as you can get.
That was Tim Allman reporting there, and that story will go up online with some pictures. You should check them out. Cute little dog. Time for some of your feedback now, and there is a lot of it around the capital gains tax. This person says, what is the point of a government having a mandate for voters to vote on when a minority party looks after its own members and all the rules everybody else, Sorry. Jack Craw says it's too easy for the Prime Minister to blame coalition politics. She stated no CGT under my leadership, thereby ruling it out post-2020, even if New Zealand First is out of Parliament. Profoundly disappointing, says Jack. Rob has a different view, though. He says, good call, Jacinda, on no CGT. Great to see a leader who is listening to the people. Best news I've heard all year, says this listener. My lawyer advised the associated costs dealing with property transactions was phenomenal and something that would have to be passed on to clients. Good on Winston. This person says, if there is to be no CGT, I accept that this is due to the actions of New Zealand First, this listener says. I'm thankful that Labor is in power. I want the government to now tax the hell out of every rich person, rich company, land banker, landlord, farmer, business and exploiter that exists in New Zealand or does business here. P.S. this person says, anti-vaxxers are nuts and are welcome to measles and polio and other diseases all on their own. Back onto the CGT though, Greg says, I wonder how many New Zealanders will die earlier than others in comparable OECD countries because Pharmac cannot be funded adequately. No CGT, live by the sword, die early by thy own sword. New Zealand, short-sighted, dumb, self-interest. Sums up New Zealanders, in my opinion, says Greg. And still more. It seemed that a CGT where the administration in collecting would cost more than the actual tax take, where determining a start value of an asset. Look how inaccurate GVs can be and disputed. It is rightly rejected. And this one from Jay-Z. As the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, redistribution will happen eventually. It can either be by a peaceful transfer of wealth or desperation will increase to the point of revolution, says this person. And the last word here, good on Winston Peters for saying no to the CGT proposed by the tax working group. Why blame Winston Peters? They say, why not blame the working group for coming up with a ridiculous proposal? Sorry, couldn't get to all your feedback. There was so much of it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening on Checkpoint. Back tomorrow.
6, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the government will be focusing on other ways to make the tax system fairer after she ruled out a capital gains tax on her watch. Business, farming and property interests have welcomed the decision, but trade unions say it's a massive setback. The cost of Auckland City Rail link has blown out to $4.4 billion. Northland DHB is blaming an anti-vaccination film for a drop in immunisation rates. And a Coromandel vehicle inspector has been suspended, accused of trying to delete failed WAF checks from the VTNZ database. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Just under 2 million people had an alert against their name. Basically a very broad net in a very small pond.
Lately with me, Karen Hayes, your late night eye on the latest headlines and the people who are making them.
As one woman said in a police report, my idea